Picture this. You're Adolf Hitler, and you've just approved the construction of a tank so massive, so overwhelmingly powerful, that you decide to name it the Maus. Yeah, the Maus. Because apparently when you're building a 188-ton death machine that can't cross bridges, can't fit through tunnels, and drinks fuel like a drunk sailor on shore leave, irony is all you've got left. This is the story of the Panzer VIII Maus, the heaviest tank ever built, and quite possibly the most expensive military mistake in human history. It's a tale of brilliant engineers trapped in a madman's fever dream, where bigger is better became bigger is impossible, and the pursuit of the ultimate weapon created something so ultimate it was completely useless. Today, we're diving into how Nazi Germany spent 2 years and countless resources building a tank that never fired a shot in anger, couldn't fight the war it was designed for, and ended up being destroyed by its own creators. Sometimes the biggest failures teach us the most about human ambition, engineering hubris, and the dangerous gap between what we dream and what we can actually build. Chapter 1. The Genesis of Giants. March 5, 1942. While most of the world was still figuring out that this whole World War II thing might drag on a bit longer than expected, some bureaucrat in the German High Command was having what can only be described as the mother of all bad ideas. He picked up his pen and issued a directive to Fried Krupp AG, the people who made cannons and steel and generally knew how to turn metal into things that exploded, telling them to develop a 100-ton heavy tank. Now, to put this in perspective, most tanks at the time weighed somewhere between 20 and 45 tons. The Germans were basically asking Krupp to build something that weighed as much as a blue whale, but with armor plating and a really big gun. Picture trying to build a motorcycle that could tow a freight train, technically possible, but you'd have to question the sanity of everyone involved. But here's where it gets interesting. 16 days later, on March 21st, the German leadership apparently decided that one impossibly massive tank project wasn't enough. So they gave Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, and yes, that Porsche, the guy whose name is now on overpriced sports cars, a separate contract for the exact same 100-ton tank goal. Because nothing says efficient wartime resource allocation like having two different teams compete to build the same impossible machine. Ferdinand Porsche wasn't just some random engineer with a fancy name, though. This guy was legitimate automotive royalty. He'd designed the Volkswagen Beetle, worked on early hybrid cars back when most people thought electricity belonged in light bulbs, and had already made his mark on German tank development. If anyone could build a 100-ton tank that actually worked, it was probably him. The key word being probably. See, by 1942, Germany had a problem. The Eastern Front was turning into a meat grinder, and the Soviets were rolling out tanks like the T-34 and KV-1 that were giving German crews some very unpleasant surprises. German tanks that had steamrolled Poland and France were suddenly running into Soviet armor they couldn't penetrate, and German anti-tank weapons were bouncing off enemy hulls like tennis balls off a brick wall. The logic was bulletproof. Enemy has thick armor? Get bigger guns. If they have bigger guns, we need thicker armor. And if we're going to have the biggest guns and thickest armor, we're going to need a really, really big tank to carry it all. This was an arms race logic that made perfect sense right up until you tried to actually build the thing. Porsche's initial concept was revolutionary in the most German way possible, over-engineered to an almost artistic degree. Instead of a traditional mechanical transmission, which would have been the sensible approach, Porsche decided to go with an electric drive system. The tank's engine would power generators, which would feed electricity to motors that turned the tracks. Think of it as building a locomotive that happened to have armor plating and a cannon. On paper, this electric transmission was brilliant. It promised smooth acceleration, precise control, and the ability to turn the massive vehicle with the finesse of a much smaller tank. In reality, well, let's just say there's a reason most tanks still use mechanical transmissions today. The vision was intoxicating. An impenetrable fortress on tracks that could punch through any defensive line, shrug off any enemy fire, and single-handedly turn the tide of battle. It would be the ultimate breakthrough weapon, the tank to end all tanks, the steel beast that would make every other armored vehicle on the planet obsolete. What they were actually building was a 188-ton monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition, but nobody knew that yet. Chapter 2. The Führer's Design. June 1942. Picture Ferdinand Porsche walking into a meeting with Adolf Hitler, carrying blueprints for what would become the world's most expensive paperweight. Porsche had his VK 100.01, or as he liked to call it, the Type 205, all sketched out and ready to present. And Hitler, being Hitler, took one look at this mechanical monster and thought, you know what, this is exactly what we need. Now, most people would look at plans for a 100-ton tank and ask reasonable questions like how do we transport this thing? Or what happens when it gets stuck? Or are we sure this is the best use of our steel? But Hitler wasn't most people. Hitler was the kind of guy who saw a massive engineering challenge and immediately started thinking about how to make it even more challenging. The Führer's approval was swift and enthusiastic. This wasn't just a tank. This was a statement, a rolling declaration that German engineering could accomplish anything. Physics be damned. Imagine someone had told Hitler he could have a pet dragon, and instead of asking if dragons were real, he started planning where to build the stable. Within weeks, on July 17, Hitler had issued a contract to Krupp for the turret design. The project now had an official codename, PZ.KPFW, Mäuschen. Mäuschen translating roughly to Little Mouse, which was either the most ironic name in military history or Hitler's idea of a really elaborate inside joke. It's like calling a tornado a light breeze or naming your Great Dane Tiny. But naming conventions were just the beginning of Hitler's creative input. By December 1942, even Mäuschen apparently wasn't ironic enough, because they changed it from Mammut, which would have made sense, since mammoths were actually big, to Mäuschen. The name would eventually be shortened to just Maus, cementing this as the greatest example of nominative irony in armored warfare history. Here's where things started getting really interesting, in the Chinese curse sort of way. Hitler wasn't content to just approve the project and let the engineers do their thing. Oh no, the Führer had opinions about tank design, and he was going to share them whether the laws of physics agreed or not. The original concept called for a 100-ton tank with reasonable armament and decent mobility, but Hitler looked at those specs and apparently thought, you know what this needs? More everything. More armor, more gun, more weight, more problems. Picture ordering a hamburger and then demanding they add 17 more patties, a lobster, and a small aircraft engine. The engineers at Porsche and Krupp suddenly found themselves solving problems that shouldn't exist. How do you build tracks that can support 100 tons without sinking into the ground? How do you power something that heavy? How do you even steer the thing? These weren't just engineering challenges, they were physics dissertations waiting to happen. Porsche's electric transmission system, which had seemed clever for a 100-ton tank, was now being asked to move something that was rapidly approaching twice that weight. It was like designing a bicycle and then being told it needed to pull a freight train. The system might work in theory, but theory and reality were about to have a very unpleasant conversation. The armor specifications alone were becoming absurd. Hitler wanted protection that could stop anything the Allies could throw at it, which sounds reasonable until you realize that anything included weapons that didn't exist yet and armor thickness that required steel plates you could use as small buildings. Meanwhile, the teams at Krupp were trying to design a turret for a tank that was rapidly becoming less tank and more mobile fortress. The turret alone was going to weigh more than most complete tanks, and it needed to mount guns big enough to justify the existence of this rolling monument to excess. What had started as an ambitious but theoretically possible project was rapidly transforming into an exercise in military fantasy. The engineers knew it, but nobody wanted to be the guy who told Hitler that his pet project was becoming an impossibility. That's a conversation that historically didn't go well for the person bringing the bad news. The vision was still intoxicating. An unstoppable weapon that would change warfare forever. The reality was becoming a logistical nightmare wrapped in an engineering impossibility with a side order of resource catastrophe. But hey, at least they had a really ironic name for it. Chapter 3, Ambition Exceeds Reality. January 3, 1943. Happy New Year, German armaments industry. You're about to get the worst present in industrial history. Hitler had spent the holidays thinking about his pet tank project, and apparently his New Year's resolution was to make an impossible project even more impossible. So he issued an order that would have made any sane logistics officer reach for the strongest alcohol available. Production of the Maus would be split between not one, not two, but three different manufacturers, Porsche, Krupp, and Alket. Now, splitting production between multiple manufacturers can sometimes be a good idea. It spreads risk, increases capacity, and creates healthy competition. But that's for normal things, like cars or washing machines or other products that exist in the realm of physical possibility. For a tank that was already pushing the boundaries of what German industry could accomplish, dividing the effort was like trying to perform surgery with three different surgical teams working on the same patient simultaneously. Porsche would handle the hull design and electric transmission systems, his specialty. Krupp would build the armor and turrets, their bread and butter, and Alket would do final assembly, which sounds simple until you realize they'd be trying to put together components from two different manufacturers who were essentially competing with each other while building parts for the same impossible machine. But Hitler wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up. The Führer had been looking at those armament specifications, and apparently the planned main gun wasn't impressive enough for his taste. The original design called for a substantial but reasonable main weapon. Hitler looked at that and thought, you know what this needs? The biggest gun we can possibly fit, plus another gun just in case the first gun gets lonely. So in January 1943, Hitler issued another decree. The Maus would carry a 128mm KWK 44-liter/55 main gun, a monster cannon that was already being developed for fixed fortifications, along with a coaxial 75mm KWK 44-liter/36.5 secondary gun. This wasn't a tank anymore, it was a mobile artillery piece with delusions of grandeur. To put this in perspective, most Allied tanks were carrying 75mm to 76mm main guns. The Germans had just decided their new tank needed a 128mm main gun that was bigger than some naval cannons, plus a 75mm backup gun that would have been considered a perfectly adequate main gun for most tanks. Picture bringing a flamethrower to a knife fight, except the flamethrower also had a machine gun attached and fired nuclear missiles. The engineers took one look at these new requirements and quietly began updating their calculations. The weight projections, which had already grown from the original 100 tons to something approaching 150 tons, suddenly took another massive leap upward. Adding that much firepower meant adding the structural support to handle it, the ammunition storage to feed it, and the electrical systems to operate it. Meanwhile, some marketing genius in the German High Command decided that München wasn't quite right for this project. In February 1943, they officially changed the name to simply Maus. The irony was now complete. They were building the heaviest armored vehicle in human history and calling it a Maus. It was either the most elaborate joke in military history or a sign that everyone involved had completely lost touch with reality. The engineers at Porsche and Krupp were starting to realize they had a problem. Actually, they had several problems. The weight was spiraling out of control. The power requirements were becoming astronomical. The ground pressure, how much the tank would weigh per square inch of track contact, was approaching levels that would make the thing sink into anything softer than a concrete highway. Then there were the practical issues nobody wanted to talk about. How do you transport something that weighs as much as a small building? Most bridges in Europe were designed for far lighter loads. Railways could theoretically handle the weight, but you'd need specialized rail cars and couldn't go through tunnels. And once you got it to the battlefield, how do you support it? The thing would need fuel at a rate that would make a small city jealous. The budget meetings were getting weird. Really weird. Steel that could have built several normal tanks was being dedicated to a single vehicle. The electrical components alone required materials that were desperately needed for other war production. And this was all for a single prototype. Hitler wanted 150 of these things eventually. The engineers were caught between their professional pride and their growing realization that they were building something that violated several laws of practical engineering. They were brilliant people working on a project that was rapidly becoming an elaborate demonstration of why bigger isn't always better. But admitting that meant telling Hitler he was wrong, and that was not a conversation anyone wanted to have. Chapter 4. The Mock-Up and the Promise. Spring 1943. Somewhere in a German factory, a group of very talented carpenters were working on what was arguably the most expensive piece of furniture in human history. They were building a full-scale wooden mock-up of the Maus, complete in every detail except for the minor issue that it couldn't actually move, shoot, or do any of the things a tank was supposed to do. But it looked impressive as hell, and sometimes that's all that matters when you're trying to sell an impossible idea to a dictator. Building a wooden mock-up might seem like an odd way to spend wartime resources, but it made perfect sense from a German engineering perspective. Before you commit to manufacturing something that's going to consume the steel production of a small nation, you probably want to make sure all the pieces fit together. Plus, Hitler was a visual guy. He needed to see his vision made manifest, even if it was made of pine planks and wishful thinking instead of armor plate and high explosives. The mock-up was a work of art in its own right. Every rivet, every armor plate angle, every component was reproduced with meticulous German precision. Walking around this thing, you'd get the full visceral impact of just how massive the Maus was going to be. It wasn't just big. It was, dear God, what have we done big? It was, this is definitely not going to fit through the garage door big. May 14, 1943. The day Hitler came to inspect his wooden dragon. Picture this scene. The Führer walks into the workshop and sees his vision made real for the first time. Not plans, not drawings, not engineer sketches, an actual, full-size representation of the most powerful tank ever conceived. The thing towered over everyone in the room like a mechanical cathedral. Standing next to it, grown men looked like children. Even other German tanks, which were hardly small, would look like toys beside this monster. Hitler's reaction was everything the engineers had hoped for and everything they should have been terrified of. He was absolutely enchanted. This wasn't just a weapon. This was validation of everything he believed about German superiority, about the power of will over reality, about the ability to make the impossible possible through sheer force of determination. The Führer walked around the mock-up like a kid in the world's most dangerous toy store. He examined every detail, asked technical questions that made the engineers sweat, and generally behaved like someone who had just been shown the keys to the kingdom of mechanical supremacy. This was his vision made real, and he loved everything about it. Well, almost everything. Hitler stopped in front of the main gun and frowned. The 128mm cannon, which was already absurdly large by any rational standard, apparently looked too small relative to the massive tank body. "It looks like a toy gun," he complained, which was possibly the first time in history that someone described a 128mm cannon as insufficiently intimidating. This is where things went from ambitious but theoretically possible to completely detached from reality. Hitler didn't just want the gun to be bigger, he wanted it to look bigger. The proportions had to be right, the aesthetic had to match the ambition. If you're going to build the ultimate tank, it needs to look like the ultimate tank, physics be damned. The engineers tried to explain that the gun was already at the limits of what they could fit, but Hitler was having none of it. Make it bigger. Make it look more impressive. Make it worthy of the tank it was mounted on. Imagine demanding that a skyscraper's windows be bigger because the current ones didn't look impressive enough from the street. But the gun was just the beginning. Hitler started examining the armor specifications, and apparently those weren't impressive enough either. The mock-up showed armor that was already thicker than anything on any operational tank, but Hitler wanted more. More protection, more steel, more everything. The weight projections, which had already climbed from 100 tons to 150 tons to 180 tons, suddenly took another massive leap toward 200 tons. The engineers were frantically scribbling calculations in the margins of their notebooks. At this weight, the tank would create more ground pressure per square inch than most construction equipment. It would sink into soft ground like a stone through water. It would be unable to cross most bridges in Europe. It would require fuel at a rate that would make supplying it a logistical nightmare. But Hitler was in full visionary mode, and practical concerns were not welcome at this particular party. On May 14, 1943, riding high on the sight of his wooden dream made manifest, Adolf Hitler issued an order that would haunt German industry for the next 2 years. Immediate production of the first series of 150 Maus tanks. 150. Not one prototype to test the concept. Not 5 to work out the bugs. 150 production vehicles of a design that existed only as a wooden mock-up and was already violating several fundamental principles of armored vehicle design. The engineers smiled, nodded, and quietly began updating their resumes. Chapter 5. Reality Strikes Back. August 1, 1943. While Hitler was probably still daydreaming about his 150-tank Maus army rolling across Europe like mechanical gods of war, the engineers at Alcott were staring at a pile of blueprints and components that looked less like the foundation of military supremacy, and more like the world's most expensive jigsaw puzzle. They had officially begun assembly work on the first prototype, and reality was already knocking on the door with a very large and very unfriendly hammer. The thing about building something that's never been built before is that every single component becomes a custom engineering challenge. When you're building a normal tank, you can rely on decades of accumulated knowledge about what works and what doesn't. Engines, transmissions, tracks, armor, these are all well understood technologies with established manufacturing processes. But when you're building a 188-ton monster that's heavier than most buildings, suddenly every bolt, every gear, every piece of steel becomes a unique problem requiring a unique solution. The tracks alone were an engineering nightmare. They had to be strong enough to support nearly 200 tons of tank while still being flexible enough to actually move. Picture trying to design a bicycle chain that could pull a freight train without braking. The Alcott engineers were discovering that theory and practice had very different opinions about the feasibility of the Maus. On paper, everything looked possible. In the workshop, surrounded by components that required specialized cranes just to move, the magnitude of what they were attempting was becoming uncomfortably clear. Meanwhile, the electrical systems that Porsche had designed were revealing their own personality quirks. Remember, this was 1943, electronics were still relatively primitive, and the idea of using electricity to power something as large and complex as a tank was pushing the boundaries of available technology. The generators, motors, and control systems all had to be custom-built, tested, and integrated into a vehicle that was essentially a prototype of an untested concept. Then came August 4, 1943, the day the war came home to the Maus project in the most literal way possible. Allied bombers, probably having no idea they were about to strike a blow against the world's most impractical tank, dropped their loads on the Krupp plant in Essen. The bombing was part of the broader Allied strategy to disrupt German war production. But for the Maus project, it was catastrophe on a personal scale. The bombs didn't just damage buildings and equipment, they destroyed irreplaceable technical documentation. Blueprints, engineering drawings, test data, manufacturing specifications, years of development work went up in smoke and flame. The wooden mock-up that Hitler had admired just 3 months earlier was reduced to splinters and ash. Picture watching years of doctoral research burn up in a house fire. But the bombing delivered an even more personal blow to the project. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the head of the Krupp industrial empire and one of the driving forces behind German armament production, suffered a severe stroke on August 5, the day after the bombing. Whether it was the stress of seeing his life's work literally go up in flames or just terrible timing, Gustav Krupp's stroke effectively removed one of the project's most powerful advocates from the equation. Gustav Krupp wasn't just some suit in a boardroom, he was German steel royalty, a man whose family name was synonymous with German steel and German military power. His stroke was both a personal tragedy and a symbolic blow to the entire German armaments industry. Suddenly, one of the few people with enough influence to keep the Maus project alive was fighting for his own life instead of fighting for his tanks. The engineering teams found themselves in the surreal position of trying to reconstruct destroyed documentation while simultaneously continuing development of a tank that was looking increasingly like a solution in search of a problem. They were working from memory, backup drawings, and sheer engineering intuition to rebuild years of technical work. This is where the first serious voices of dissent began to emerge from the German military establishment. Heinz Guderian, who wasn't just any general but the guy who literally wrote the book on armored warfare, took one look at the Maus specifications and pointed out something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The thing had no defensive machine guns for close combat. Think about that for a second. They were building a tank designed to break through enemy lines and operate in hostile territory, and they'd forgotten to include weapons to deal with enemy infantry who might get too close for the main gun to engage. Picture designing a fortress and forgetting to include doors, or building an aircraft carrier and forgetting to include a way for planes to land on it. Guderian's criticism highlighted a fundamental problem with the entire Maus concept. It had been designed by committee, with Hitler's aesthetic preferences taking precedence over practical military requirements. The result was a weapon that looked impressive and could theoretically destroy anything it could see, but couldn't defend itself against a determined soldier with a satchel charge. Meanwhile, Albert Speer was receiving reports that were making his job as armaments minister increasingly uncomfortable. The Maus project was consuming resources at a rate that was starting to affect other, more practical military production. Steel that could have built multiple conventional tanks was being dedicated to a single prototype. Skilled workers were being diverted from proven weapons to work on an unproven concept. The dream was colliding with reality, and reality was winning. Chapter 6. The Dream Dies. October 27, 1943. Albert Speer walked into what was probably the most awkward meeting in German armaments history, carrying news that was going to make a lot of very smart people very unhappy. Speer, who had the thankless job of trying to keep German war production running while Hitler kept ordering increasingly impossible weapons, had finally reached his breaking point with the Maus project. Picture this scene: a room full of engineers, designers, and project managers who had spent the better part of 2 years trying to build the impossible, only to be told that their impossible dream was being officially declared impossible. Imagine spending years building a rocket to the moon, only to have someone walk in and remind you that the moon doesn't actually exist. Speer's announcement was blunt and devastating. Mass production of the Maus was cancelled. Not delayed, not postponed, not reduced, cancelled. The dream of 150 supertanks rolling across Europe was officially dead, killed not by enemy action or technical failure, but by the cold mathematics of industrial reality. Speer's reasoning was brutally logical, which probably made it even harder for the engineers to accept. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts against enemies who were producing weapons by the thousands. What Germany needed wasn't technological marvels that consumed enormous resources. It needed simple, effective weapons that could be manufactured quickly and in large numbers. The Maus represented everything that was wrong with German war production in 1943. It was technically brilliant but practically useless, resource-intensive but militarily irrelevant, impressive to look at but impossible to deploy effectively. While Germany was spending years and countless tons of steel on a single prototype tank, the Soviets were cranking out T-34s by the hundreds, and the Americans were perfecting mass production techniques that would eventually bury German industry under an avalanche of war materiel. Speer had done the math, and the math was unforgiving. The steel required for one Maus could build several Panzer IVs or Tigers. The manufacturing hours needed for the Maus could produce dozens of conventional weapons. The skilled workers dedicated to the project could be building fighters, submarines, anti-aircraft guns, or any of the 1,000 other things Germany desperately needed. Think of it as a harsh lesson in opportunity cost delivered at the worst possible time. Every resource dedicated to the Maus was a resource not available for weapons that could actually affect the outcome of the war. And by late 1943, Germany was running out of resources, running out of time, and definitely running out of the luxury of building vanity projects for a dictator's ego. November 5, 1943. The official orders came down like a death sentence written in bureaucratic language. Production reduced to 2 hulls and 1 turret. Not 150 tanks, not even a dozen. 2 hulls and 1 turret, basically enough to prove the concept worked before admitting it was a terrible idea. The engineering team's reaction to the cancellation was complicated, which is probably the most diplomatic way to describe the emotional whiplash of having your life's work suddenly declared irrelevant. On one hand, there was genuine disappointment. These were brilliant people who had been working on what was arguably the most challenging engineering project of their careers. On the other hand, there was probably some relief that the impossible pressure to make the impossible possible was finally being lifted. Imagine spending 2 years trying to solve problems that had never existed before, knowing that failure meant disappointing not just your boss or your company, but the Führer himself. The stress of trying to build something that was pushing the boundaries of physics while also meeting increasingly absurd requirements had to be crushing. The cancellation meant they could stop pretending that 188 tons of tank was a practical military solution. But Ferdinand Porsche wasn't ready to give up on his electrical dragon just yet. While Speer was explaining to everyone why the Maus was a resource-consuming monster that would bankrupt German industry, Porsche was quietly making plans to continue development anyway. This wasn't just professional pride. This was a man who had spent his career making the impossible possible, and he wasn't about to let a little thing like official cancellation stop him from seeing his vision through to completion. Porsche had invested too much of himself in the project to just walk away. The electric transmission system, the innovative design solutions, the sheer audacity of the concept, these weren't just engineering achievements, they were extensions of his identity as an innovator. Canceling mass production was one thing, but abandoning the prototypes entirely was something Porsche simply couldn't accept. So while the official Maus program was dying a bureaucratic death in conference rooms and budget meetings, the actual first prototype was nearing completion in the Alket workshops. The engineers and technicians continued their work, not sure if they were building a proof of concept or the world's most expensive museum piece. The irony was perfect and painful. Just as the German war machine was finally admitting that the Maus was too expensive and impractical to build, the first example was actually becoming real. All that remained was to see if the thing could actually work. December 23, 1943. The first Maus prototype rolled out of the factory, weighing in at exactly 188 tons of German engineering ambition. It was a Christmas miracle wrapped in armor plating and powered by the world's most expensive electric motor. And just like many Christmas presents, it looked impressive under the tree but turned out to be completely useless in real life. The testing program that followed was less rigorous evaluation and more expensive therapy session. The Maus could move, technically speaking, at the blazing top speed of 13 miles per hour on roads and 6 miles per hour cross-country. For comparison, that's slower than most people jog. It consumed fuel like a small city, required specialized transport equipment that didn't exist, and had a habit of breaking things just by existing in the same general area. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed. V1 got an engine but no turret. V2 got a turret but engine problems. Picture having 2 halves of a really expensive, really impractical sandwich. The Germans spent the last months of the war driving their Maus around in circles, probably wondering how they'd managed to spend 2 years and untold resources building the world's heaviest military parade float. When the Red Army approached the testing facility in 1945, the Germans did what any reasonable person would do with 188 tons of evidence of questionable decision-making. They blew it up. V1 was destroyed completely, V2 survived partially, and today you can see the reconstructed remains in a Russian museum, where it serves as a monument to what happens when engineering brilliance meets strategic stupidity. The Maus project failed spectacularly, but it failed in exactly the way you'd expect something called Maus to fail when it weighed more than a blue whale. It was the perfect metaphor for late-war German military thinking, technically impressive, strategically irrelevant, and consuming resources that could have been used for weapons that might have actually mattered. Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the biggest failures. The Maus taught us that bigger isn't always better, that engineering problems can't be solved by throwing more steel at them, and that when you're fighting a war of production, building one invincible superweapon is less useful than building 100 reliable regular weapons. Also, if you're going to name your secret weapon after a small, harmless animal, maybe reconsider your entire approach to psychological warfare.